think I'll just kick it off now. Hi everyone, my name is Haifa Khatib. I am a marketing assistant here at InfoTrack. I'm delighted to be joined by Amy Bell of Teal Compliance, who will be taking us through the key takeaways from the 5th AML Directive and provide some guidance on how to apply it, as well as an understanding of what Safe Harbour is and how digital onboarding supports a compliant digital ID journey. And Amy is also joined by Lauren French, who is a product manager for our electronic client onboarding solution. And I just want to go through some housekeeping. We do have a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So if you do have any questions, please submit into the Q&A box and we'll answer the questions at the end of the session. This webinar is also being recorded. So if you do want to look over this webinar at a later time, we will be sending over a link for the on-demand recording tomorrow. So don't worry about that. But without further ado, I'm just going to hand it over to Amy.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. My name is Amy Bell, Director of Teal Compliance, and also returning chair of the Law Society's Money Laundering Task Force. So I'm a solicitor. I've been working in compliance for about 18 years now, and anti-money laundering is my very favourite thing. So thank you to InfoTrack for inviting me to come and talk to you today. So the world of AML changes all the time, actually. I wish it just stayed the same for a little bit, but we have to keep grappling with changes as the government looks to improve the regime. But AML isn't the only reason you do client ID. And so in today's session, what I wanted to talk about is the increasing pressure we have from regulators to be able to demonstrate that we have processes that are working, are being followed. I'm going to share with you some horror stories, and hopefully they don't scare you too much, because hopefully you're feeling that you have got policies and procedures that you need, but it does demonstrate the increased appetite of the regulator to hold firms and individuals responsible for non-compliance. So it's important that we do understand what our obligations are. And then I'm going to have a little look at the relationship between the Proceeds of Crime Act, which is, the offences of acting for baddies, and then the money laundering regulations and how they relate to each other, because they're not codependent. You can be compliant with one and breach the other. And I just want to reinforce that, because what I found lately is once we make that super clear, the relationship between the two, it kind of makes sense why you're asking all the other questions. Then we'll look at due diligence. We'll look at the impact of the 5th Money Laundering Directive. Quick spoiler, didn't have a massive impact. It did change some stuff, and one bit in particular around the use of technology in your CDD process that I want to cover. And then look at what other things you've got to think about, not just AML, what things have we got to have in place to prevent fraud. We'll touch on the Safe Harbour and how you can use the benefits of technology to improve your due diligence processes, specifically for combating fraud. And then lastly, at the end, everybody, I think, especially in the conveyancing world, we do know that it is a risk for money laundering. The National Risk Assessment has conveyancing as high risk for money laundering. And part of that, yes, it's good to make sure that you are actually acting for who you think you're acting for, and that the person's connected to the property if they're selling it, all of those things. But actually, you only stop money laundering if you don't move dirty money. And so what are we needing to do for source of funds, source of wealth? Why is that important? So I want to tell you a sad tale about a solicitor who went to prison, who was a conveyancing solicitor. Again, not meant to give you nightmares, but just to give you some visibility. There's I think a chat box, a question function. If there's anything you want to ask me about, hopefully we'll have some time at the end to cover off any questions. So if there's anything you want to know, then just let me know, and I'll crack on with sharing some slides. The slides are available. If it's on the slide, don't feel you have to take loads of notes or anything. Mainly there for reference. But what I did want to set the scene really about regulators, there has been a huge shift in, as I say, the activities of the regulator as they have geared themselves up to demonstrate that they are effective in supporting preventing money laundering. that focus on the regulator being able to demonstrate that they are effective on preventing anti-money laundering will likely extend to other types of financial crime, like fraud. They'll be interested in what you're doing to prevent fraud. They're also interested in what you're doing to prevent breaches of the sanctions regime, slightly outside of the topic today. But what we are seeing is this continued pressure from the government to make sure that the regulators are effective. So we've seen some record-breaking fines. The biggest fine so far last year for Mr. Conderea, which was £232,500. Now, obviously a big firm. And you might say, well, that doesn't sound like a lot in the scheme of things. But part of the criticism there were people attending training. Like, were people actually going to training? And, you know, it's one of the things that we do in our day job at Teal, we do training. And I used to be a training manager of a law firm for about 7 years. And all of the repeat sessions I had to put on for people who couldn't attend at the particular time was running the training, the mop-up sessions, we called them, so everybody could get some training. We can't let people miss the training. It's the latest LSAG, the Legal Sector Affinity Group, which is what we have to follow in the law, in the legal sector, recommends that refresher training is at least annual. Now that is a change, because for the longest time that practice note recommended every 2 years. So now we're moving to annual refresher training, and they're disciplining firms when that's not happening. Now, if you might think £232,500 not a lot for a massive firm like Mishcon, what about £20,000 for a 2-partner firm in Oxford? Just last week, this hit the headlines. This is the first fine under the SRA's new fining powers that they have. They've got increased fining powers, in part to deal with AML issues. Now, this was an interesting case. No allegations of any money laundering taking place, folks. Just that their processes and procedures were vulnerable to money laundering taking place. They don't actually have to connect the behaviour of the law firm to actual money laundering in order to be taking it incredibly seriously and disciplining the firm. This particular firm had policies that still referred to the 2007 money laundering regulations. Obviously, I wasn't involved, but I can only go off what's reported about it. Apparently, one of the partners didn't know of the existence of the AML policy. The other one hadn't had any training on the 2017 money laundering regulations. You know, we are now 5.5 years since quite a wholesale change, a big change in the regulations, and the firm the staff weren't notified of the up-to-date regulations. They hadn't, here's an interesting one. If any of you are money laundering reporting officers and money laundering compliance officers, the firm hadn't established an independent audit function. Now, this is interesting. If you're regulated by the SRA, a few years ago, they came out and they said they expected most firms to establish an independent audit function. Now, establishing an independent audit function is not mandatory in the regulations unless you are a relevant size and nature where the risk means that you should have one. And that's been interpreted by the regulator. And you can also see this if you look at the LSAG guidance. LSAG is a wider group than just the SRA. It's all of the supervisors and representative bodies make up LSAG. And in there, they're pointing to, they think that we should be as inclusive as possible in deploying these additional controls in Regulation 21, of which audit is one. Now, your independent audit function does not have to be external. You don't have to come to someone like Teal to get it done. You can do it yourself internally, provided that the person doing it is sufficiently competent in AML to know what they're looking at, and that they are not involved in the AML function, setting it up in the first place or running it now. They have to be independent from the function. Now, that's a challenge for a lot of firms. So if you've got a 2-partner firm, I think that will be a challenge. What we see here is a criticism of this firm. The factors making up how they've disciplined the firm include they'd expected this firm, they did property work, conveyancing work, to have established an independent audit function. So I think another interesting point from the regulator is a couple of editions ago of their annual reports, I think it was, they commented that the firms that they had taken forward for disciplinary hadn't had an independent audit. The implication being if they had, they wouldn't have had the problems that the SRA then went and found. So it's a huge fine for a 2-partner firm, and I don't think they're getting any less. Individuals have been disciplined by the regulator as well. We've got issues here, not where you necessarily have acted for a baddie, but where you haven't attended the training, you've not done the appropriate level of client due diligence, which might not be about their ID, about who they are, but might be about their source of funds, source of wealth, and that you haven't done enough checking, bearing in mind the risk. We've got Mr. Patel, another sole practitioner, £12,500. Now, when you see these agreed decisions, you know, they're not like a tariff. It was £500 for that, and it was £1,000 for that. It's just like one big number. But you can look at the factors that they were concerned about, and they were concerned in Mr. Patel's case. He was acting for a baddie, so obviously they were concerned that the weaknesses in his processes had potentially facilitated money laundering. But look at this one, a £2,000 overpayment of a £60 gas bill. So obviously Mr. Patel or someone in his team had gathered the gas bill as part of the ID process, part of the verification of address process. And what they said Mr. Patel had failed to appreciate was that there was a massive overpayment. Now, why is that significant? Money Laundering 101, paid some money in, asked for it back. And they say Mr. Patel had failed to spot that. Now, let me ask you, if you do get a utility bill as part of your client ID process, what do you look at? Generally, the answer I get when I ask that question is the name and address, not what's on it. If I teach you nothing else today, folks, if it's on your file, please make sure you've read it. And that includes search results from providers. Make sure you've read it and you've understood it. You can explain what it's telling you. Mr. Sharif. Now, Mr. Sharif acted for a politically exposed person. Well, in fact, two. They were sisters. There are no allegations that there was any money laundering, but he hadn't followed the requirements and the regulations for politically exposed people, mainly because he didn't know they were politically exposed people because he hadn't checked. Slight problem, £85,000 day at the tribunal there. Now, he was the firm's money laundering reporting officer, which may have aggravated the fine, but still very serious fines for somebody who hadn't necessarily been facilitating money laundering. There's not necessarily a connection, and that's what I wanted to explain, this connection between the two. If we can get this and we can explain this in our firms, I think we will go quite a way to us understanding what our obligations are under the money laundering regulations. So I'm sure everybody on today, if you've been working in the sector for any length of time, you must have had some AML training. This can't be the first AML training you've ever had. I'm guessing it's not, okay? And in that AML training, you probably heard about the main offences under the Proceeds of Crime Act, POCA. Those are the three offences that make up money laundering. So you've got Section 327, which is concealing, converting, disguising criminal property. That's what you'd expect it to be. If you're giving somebody by a drug dealer and you buy them a house, you've converted it from the cash to a house. Pretty straightforward, right? If you are helping them to do that, obviously need your services to buy a house, so you're becoming concerned in an arrangement while you're doing that, which is Section 328. And if you have that money pass through your client account, pay it out to the vendor solicitors, you are going to acquire it for a while in your client account, aren't you? So you're likely to commit all three. You can commit them all individually. You can it's difficult to convert something without also acquiring, using, and have possession of it if it's money, but not impossible. You can become concerned in an arrangement without actually touching any money. Creating, when we talk about trust and company service provision, is high risk for money laundering. Creating a company or a trust which is going to be used to receive and hold criminal property, separate offence. If you know or suspect. Now, for any of those offences, you have to know or suspect that that's what you're doing. Know or suspect that you're dealing with criminal property. There's also the offence at the bottom, Section 330. This is the failure to report your suspicions offence. I'm going to tell you about a lawyer who went to prison for this later on. Now, this one is that you do know or suspect, or you should know or suspect, someone's involved in money laundering. You heard about it at work in the regulated sector, which transactional work, property work is generally that in the regulated sector, and you failed to report your suspicions. That's how that works. That's 5 years in prison. Now, for the first three offences, as I said, you have to know or suspect that you've got dirty money. The one at the bottom, they can infer you should have known or suspected that you had dirty money, and that's how they what they have to prove to the court to successfully prosecute you. Okay, on the other side of the slide is the other bit of legislation that we're concerned with when it comes to money laundering. That's the money laundering regulations. As I say, we're up to the 2017 version. They've been amended a few times already, actually, but the main kind of body of it is the 2017 money laundering regulations. Now, that said, it is an offence for which you could go to prison for 2 years for not complying with the money laundering regulations. When we talk about these terms under the regulations, people use the acronyms interchangeably, but they are very different things. So the whole activity you're required to do under the money laundering regulations is called client due diligence, okay? CDD. CDD comprises of the 5 activities that I've got on the slide there: a matter risk assessment, identifying the client, getting information off them, that means verifying it, proving what they've told you by way of information which is independent from them, understanding the purpose and nature, that's where source of funds and wealth sits, and then ongoing monitoring, carrying on thinking about it all the way through. So in order to comply with the money laundering regulations, you've got to do all 5 of those things. When we think about AML activity, anti-money laundering activity in the firm, we often think about ID&V, passports, utility bills, electronic check, Safe Harbour equivalent things, that's your ID&V. And then you've got your purpose and nature, which is the source of funds, source of wealth stuff, where you're obtaining bank statements or you're looking at open banking, that kind of stuff. It's not just that, purpose and nature, why are they doing this thing? A lot of these questions about purpose and nature, folks, they come up in conversation with the client. Why are you moving? Why are you buying this house? Oh, I'm moving to the area so I can look after my mum. Purpose and nature, does this make sense why they're doing it? Because, you know, baddies, they don't have a good purpose and nature explanation because there isn't one. They're just trying to launder the money. There's no reason for it. So their explanation will be pretty poor as to why they're doing what they're doing. So listen, that's a kind of 10-second run through, something you probably sat through 90 minutes of a course to tell you about one day. But it's important we set the scene here. Now, in between these 2 pieces of legislation, you can see this great big teal block of colour. That's there on purpose to say this. These pieces of legislation operate independently of each other, which means that you can do all your client due diligence and be compliant with the money laundering regulations. But if you know or suspect that they've got dirty money, then you can commit a POCA offence. We all know that, right? That's why we report things to our money laundering reporting officer. If during the due diligence something fishy emerges, you report it to the MLRO. But the opposite is true, and this is the thing a lot of people miss. You can be acting for someone for whom you have no concerns that they're a baddie, the Archbishop of Canterbury. But if you don't do the client due diligence, all 5 of the things on the money laundering regulation side of the slide, then that is an offence. And this is what we see in the disciplinary cases. No allegations that there's a POCA offence, but they're still being disciplined under the money laundering regulations. So again, if you learn nothing else from me today, please learn this. Client due diligence is a matter-based activity. It's required because of the work you're doing, not who you're doing it for. It might be that you do less, depending on who you're doing it for. You might do less due diligence for the Archbishop of Canterbury's source of funds, source of wealth, than you might do for, I don't know, Joe Bloggs down the street. You might do less for if your client's the NHS and they're selling off some property. Than you would do from somebody else that you didn't know from Adam and they just turned up and wanted your services. You can flex the amount of due diligence you do based on the risk from the client and the matter. You can't not do it at all. Okay, I'm sure you know that, right? And the reason that they put a criminal offence attached to the money laundering regulations is because they really want you to ask around, you know, address your mind to who this person is, but also understand their source of funds, source of wealth, and the purpose and nature. You see, because if you don't understand how they make the money, why they happen to have this money, what they're trying to achieve with this transaction, very unlikely you're ever going to spot a POCA offence. That's why they make you ask the questions. So, you know, when you get clients and they're like, oh, why have I got to do this? This is annoying. This is irritating. The point of you doing the due diligence is because we don't want baddies to have access to the system to launder their money. And so the law requires us to make sure we ask enough questions such that if they were baddies, we might be able to spot them. Now, it doesn't mean you necessarily will. One of the things about baddies is that they're often good at being baddies. So it's tricky to figure out what they're doing. But to protect yourself, you've got to demonstrate that you've done all of the jobs. Now, I can only see Lauren, so I'm hoping, Lauren, I'm making sense, yes? Am I making sense? Thank you. Cool. Right, so how these regulations come down to us, I kind of said before that the legislation we have, certainly the latest legislation that changed things for us came from the 5th Money Laundering Directive. Now we're out of Europe, so you might think, hurrah, maybe we can ditch all this stuff, but I'm afraid it's not that straightforward. The standards that we follow are based on the requirements of the Financial Action Task Force. That's a global organisation that sets the standards for money laundering. So every country that operates in the financial system will want to be able to follow the Financial Action Task Force recommendations. The task force come along and audit. So like I was talking about you guys having an independent audit, the country has an audit. We had one fairly recently. They gave us some feedback, and we've been doing loads of work since. That's why AML keeps moving, because they gave us some feedback. Oh, you could do better. If a country, I mean, I don't think you can fail an audit, but you can certainly not reach the standard. It becomes more difficult to do business with any entity established in that country. They go onto the FATF grey list. And that means, for our purposes, they could become a country which is a high-risk third country, a country where we've got concerns about how strong their AML controls are. So, yes, it is true that the EU will take the FATF standards and will create legislation, directives, and that then we will implement them, or we used to implement them into our domestic legislation, the money laundering regulations, and then we distill that down into legal sector or whichever sector guidance that to help practitioners like yourself figure out what to do. If you take the EU bit out of that equation, we'll still do it though. We'll still take the FATF requirements, we'll still have domestic legislation, we'll still have legal sector guidance. You should not expect anything to change as a result of not being in the EU anymore. There has been a 6th directive, which even though we were out when the in-force date came, a lot of the 6th directive we wouldn't have needed to do anything additional to implement because a lot of it was about the standard of criminal conduct, and we already have the toughest standard for that in the world anyway. So the rest of Europe in the 6th directive were just catching up with us rather than us having to do anything. We were already there with our all crimes approach. Even it might interest you to know, we often people say, oh, Europe, they make us have all these rules, it's so tough because of when we're in Europe. We already had 20 years ago tougher legislation than they've got today in Europe for AML to prevent it, because it's pretty important to us. It's pretty important to our financial centre. It's pretty important, the UK PLC, that we don't be seen and we are not facilitating money laundering. So there we go. The 5th Money Laundering Directive, though, did have some changes which are relevant, and I will cover those in a second. But before I get to that, I did mention these acronyms that people use interchangeably. There's 3 main ones that I think that we should make sure that we've got straight in our mind, because it does affect what we do client ID for. So we talked about CDD being all the 5 jobs on my slide: the matter risk assessment, identifying, verifying, purpose and nature, ongoing monitoring. Got to do all 5 of those things to be compliant. So CDD, all of them. Part of that is called ID and V. You'll see it referred to, ID and V, identification and verification. So that is, tell me what your name is. It is Amy Bell. Can I verify that, please? Give me a document that proves that, or a set of documents, or submit to my electronic check and I'll prove that, okay, with independent means. Okay, so you've got ID, get information from, verify, prove it, ID and V. That is part of the CDD activity. But you've also got something you might have heard of, KYC. KYC is know your client. Now, know your client is a lot wider than CDD, actually. If you do know your client, you probably tick most of the boxes for CDD. But knowing your client is can be a lot wider than that, because when you're doing CDD, remember, it's a matter-based activity. Knowing your client is about anticipating what else the client's going to do. So what is the purpose of this? So in a lot of cases, especially in straightforward residential transactions, it's dead obvious, right? They're selling this house because it's too small, they're buying this bigger house. So my relationship with this client is going to be these two separate matters, and that's what I understand them to be. Or they're selling this house, mum's selling her house, they're going to put the monies together and they buy a house with a granny flat. Whatever it is, it's fairly simple to sort out the know your client and the wider strategy activity. And when we look at client ID, it actually forms several different functions. In an AML sense, it is about being able to tell one client from another. So that the person that you're dealing with, you can find them here and they've got this date of birth, they'll be this old. And ideally that you've got a photograph of them. Now, it might interest you to know, there is no requirement in the legislation in the AML legislation to have a photograph. It is helpful then, though, because the second function of doing client ID for the money laundering regulations is to help law enforcement. It's no more complicated than that. And the reason I point this out is people often get confused as to the purpose of why we're asked to prove the things we're asked to prove in AML. What's it actually for? I'm confused is probably the wrong word. It's never even occurred to anybody to ask what's it all for. Until I say, how does getting a passport or utility bill prevent money laundering? And then of course it's really obvious, isn't it? It doesn't, because baddies live somewhere. You know, they've got a driving license, they've got a passport, they've got, especially if they're regular trips over to Marbella, you know, or other parts of Spain are available, but you know, they're international baddies, they're going to have a passport, they're going to have a utility bill, they can give you all of that. None of that prevents money laundering. So why do we do it? We do it so the policemen know where to find them if they need to. And that has happened in real life to me. You know, we had a case once. It was a remortgage case, and it was a kind of vendor fraud. So it was someone purporting to own the property and getting a mortgage on it. Property was free from mortgage, got a mortgage on it, asked our lawyer to send the money somewhere else, breached the banking facilities rules, but at the time the lawyer just wasn't aware and just put the instructions through. And then lo and behold, the mortgage wasn't being repaid a couple of months later. That was reported to the police. The police came and knocked on our door and said, have you got a photograph of the client? Have you got a picture? I said, what do you want a picture for? He said, so I can circulate it around the police forces to see if they know who this person is, because obviously we've not got his right name because he's pretending to be someone else. So, you know, it really is about law enforcement having the information so that they can chase down the baddies. There's some important things about that. If the client's identity changes, then you have to update the client ID. We'll come on to address in a second, but you know, if a client's name changes, they get, you know, this is a particular relevance at the moment when people are worried about people changing the names so that they don't turn up on sanctions lists, things like that, with recent name changes and things like that, to be aware of these, why they might be doing that. So anyway, client ID, as far as part of the function of you doing the client ID activity is to comply with a part of your CDD activity. And that is so you know one person from another and you can furnish that information to law enforcement. But that's not the only reason we do it. We also do it to prevent fraud. As I said at the very beginning, the regulators are getting more interested in a wider financial crime impact than just AML. AML is definitely there, but they're now interested in what are you doing to prevent fraud. And of course, we can't really work in property without having an awareness of the dream bar cases and the vendor fraud and the worries of that. And how if we can't rely on the ID to keep us safe there, what can we do? And so it is there to prevent fraud. And there's three types of fraud that are potentially there. Impersonation fraud, somebody giving you instructions and they're not the real person, trying to get you to do something, pretending that they're, you know, I don't know, their sister, and the sister really owns the house and they're pretending it's them so that they can run off with the money or whatever. Vendor fraud, pretending they own the property when they don't. Or mortgage fraud, getting somebody else to sign for a mortgage when they actually know nothing about it. So all of these things are functions or activities you do when you do client ID. You're trying to prevent AML, money laundering, terrorist financing, and you're also trying to prevent fraud. So it's important to make that distinction, because we can look very siloed at what we're doing. You could look at the money laundering regulations and then go, I just have to do this. But then you look at the Safe Harbour and that's something completely different. You look at the UK Finance Handbook, again, something completely different. I mean, you can probably satisfy it, all of them by doing the same, by doing one thing. But the point is, you've got to be aware of the separate responsibilities. So we did want to make flag up something specific in the 2019 money laundering regulations. In fairness, there weren't loads of changes, but some of them were quite significant in terms of your policies and procedures, especially if you engage with technology in your business. There was the recognition that technology forms a really important part of the fight against financial crime. And if we can get to a place where you guys, the regulated sector sees the benefit of using technology, then hopefully we can leverage the benefits of the technology. People can feel comfortable about it. But what they don't want is people running off implementing technology and not knowing if it helps or not, or if it makes it even worse. So one of the things that you should have in your AML policies and procedures, if you haven't got it, I recommend you start thinking about putting it in, which is if you're going to introduce new products, business practices, or new technology, and there could be, in fairness, a correlation between new business practices, where you onboard a client, and the use of technology. The two things could be connected, obviously. If you're going to introduce new stuff, you need to make sure you've conducted a risk assessment and recognise whether the implementation of that new practice or new tech improves or worsens the exposure to money laundering, and if it, or terrorist financing, and if it does, that you take steps to mitigate that risk. So I think what a regulator would be looking for here would be, should we introduce new technology or business practices, the firm will conduct a risk assessment. If you do that, then you record that risk assessment, probably as part of your firm-wide AML risk assessment, which you're all going to have. And that if there are any perceived risks, like it's easier for someone to pretend to be somebody else using this system, then what are you going to do about that? Of course, the system where, that you're probably all familiar with, or else you wouldn't be here today. A lot of the systems now, the specific purpose of them is to reduce fraud. So hopefully don't increase the risk, but you should make sure you've documented that you have thought about it. It's a bit like a lot of stuff in compliance is a bit like maths GCSE. Make sure you show you're working out of why you thought this was the right thing to do. So if you haven't got that in your policy, put it in your policy. If you are introducing new tech or have done since the 10th of January 2020, you need to make sure you've got a record of the thought process. You may well have thought about it, especially in your conversations with partners about whether to take some technology. Make sure that you have written down and made a record of that deliberation. Now I'm going to declare an interest. I have been a massive fan of using electronic verification since pretty much the very beginning of my career in this space. I was an early adopter of having a central CDD team and using electronic verification through that process. I am a massive fan of technology doing the heavy lifting for us so that we can get on with doing lawyering and looking at risks properly. And it's come on a huge long way, and so has the legislation. As I already mentioned in the 5th directive, they were cognizant of bringing things into the regulations that would give you comfort about using technology as part of your process. So electronic verification, you've got to be super clear about how it works. If you're going to use it, you need to make sure your provider explains to you how it works. One of the criticisms of money laundering compliance officers, that findings that's critical of them by the regulators, are that they don't understand how the tech works. They can't explain it. At Teal, we do a lot of independent auditing. Remember I said at the beginning, other providers are available, by the way, not just us, but we do a lot of it. And so we sit down and we speak to people and go, can you explain how the tech works for me, please? And you'd be surprised how many people that we sit down talk to who are responsible for the AML have got a system that somebody else put in, so they don't know. So if you weren't involved in buying that system, or you're not involved in reviewing how that system works, please, again, if you learn nothing else from me, go and find out how it works. Ask your vendor some questions, like, what are you checking? How often do you update it? especially if you've got sanctions checking involved. I mean, the sanctions position is moving very quickly. We want to make sure, I think most providers will be on top of it. It'd be daft not to be, right? But you just want to make sure you've asked that question. You can show to the regulator that you're applying proper diligence to your service that you're using. Yeah, be aware of what it can do, what it can't do. You know, some parts of the check can prove that information exists somewhere else about that person, but not all of it proves that the person you're dealing with is that person. So, you know, when you've got a service where you can switch things on, add things on, you've got to understand the significance of what it is doing, what it isn't doing for you. Now, the 2019 money laundering regulations made an amendment to Regulation 28. It says you can discharge your obligation to identify a natural person using electronic verification, provided that the process is secure from fraud and misuse and capable of providing an appropriate level of assurance that the person claiming a particular identity is in fact a person with that identity. So what this signifies in the 2019 money laundering regulations is a move away from get some documents to establish which door to knock on to find this person, which is how, or some checks, which is how we're looking at before. It's added in and be sure it's really them to secure from fraud. Bringing fraud in now. Remember on the last slide I was saying you do AML to make sure you know which door to knock on. Now it's saying if you're using technology and only technology to discharge this obligation, you need to make sure that it's secure from fraud. So way back in my day, when I first started in the law, you know, back then what we would do is take some data off the client, we'd put it in the system and we'd set the pass rate at multiple matches so that with this person's data, it wasn't just a fluke. They had quite a big footprint, so we were pretty sure it was them. But if I'm honest, that was just proving that a person with that data existed, that name, address, and date of birth existed, not that my client was that person. So we often were getting paper ID as well. What this is saying here is to discharge your obligation to the money laundering regulations, you can use just tech, provided that it's secure from fraud. So to get it secure from fraud and misuse, this is where using something like reading the chip, which it's Safe Harbour, something separate. Remember, we're on AML at the minute, but some technology which incorporates a document that only the real person has, biometrics, facial recognition, any of this kind of stuff. This is the protecting from fraud element. This is not just which door to knock on. So you can use technology like that, provided that you're satisfied it's got these anti-fraud measures. Again, I'm pretty sure that your vendors, you know, whichever systems you're using, will be able to explain that to you, how their system complies with that section. Then you've got the Safe Harbour stuff. So this is about vendor fraud. It's about making sure that the person is really who they say they are. This is why the groundswell of let's do something about this. And by the way, folks, that focus on preventing fraud in conveyancing is not going anywhere. Every few weeks there's a BBC online article about someone else who's had their identity stolen, appropriated, and how they've lost a load of money. So there is actually, I must check where it's up to, but in the latest economic crime bill, there's an amendment been tabled, I think possibly by Labour, to have a failure to prevent fraud offence. That would be really significant for us in the legal sector, because what the failure to prevent offences, we have them for bribery and preventing tax evasion. When we have those, they're strict liability offences. If it happens, you're on the hook unless you can show adequate procedures or reasonable procedures, depends which law you're looking at, that you tried to stop it. So this is where if you're working to this standard, you're already starting to have those procedures in place should they move to that. What, as I say, this is looking at the other function of doing client ID. It's about preventing fraud, and how it works is that you obtain the appropriate type of evidence that is checked using the service, and that we've got those measures in place, making sure it really is that person, and that you have got evidence that they are connected to that property. Obviously paper can do that, but there are obviously also electronic checks that you can do that will connect a person to a property. Okay, I'm conscious of time and I do want to make sure that we've got time to answer questions. I told you at the beginning I was going to tell you about a solicitor who went to prison for a 330 and a failure to comply with the money laundering regulations. It's a guy called Neil Bolton. He was a solicitor in a place called Stockport, Hazel Grove, actually, which is a bit of Stockport. If you've ever been to Manchester, on the train, you have to go over a great big bridge, and that's in Stockport. So he was around about there. And he was taken in, as the headline says, by an associate of Dale Cregan. Now, you might not know Dale Cregan's name, but you might know his face. He's the baddie with one eye. He killed some police officers up in Manchester a few years ago. Actually, just yesterday, his nephew was convicted of drug dealing. So there you go. So Billy Black was one of his associates. He was actually Dale's sister's boyfriend, and he had approached Neil Bolton to buy properties. There were 28 property transactions, £400,000 went through the client account. We think he was telling Neil that he was buying rental properties, and the money he was using was actually the gang's money, was actually the baddie's money. He went to prison. Now, he pleaded guilty to the 330, so he failed to report his suspicions when he knew, or he should have known, that it was a baddie, but he also pleaded guilty to failure to comply with the money laundering regulations. Here's the thing, I don't think he asked, and in fact, if you look at the news article, the allegations are that he didn't do source of funds, source of wealth checks. You don't stop money laundering with passports, utility bills, safe harbour things. You don't. You've still got to do the other bit of it, which is purpose and nature to comply and protect yourself, folks. So there were 28 activities. The other thing that I usually point out here is, I reckon, in fairness to Neil, he might have asked on the first one or two, because we're quite well drilled, aren't we? We're quite well drilled that if we get a new client, we need to find out where the money's coming from to do it. The worry I have about this one is that there were 28 matters, and I do come across people all the time who get comfortable with clients and stop asking. Remember my diagram. Client due diligence attaches to the work you're doing, not who you're doing it for. Just because you've acted for a client before doesn't mean you don't have to think about source of funds, source of wealth in every matter. Clearly Neil didn't, clearly he went to prison. So please don't be that person. A good understanding of the difference between source of funds, source of wealth is important. Source of funds is the money you're going to use. Source of wealth is where they got it from in the first place. A lot of people labour under a misapprehension that if the money's in a UK bank account, then it's fine. I understand why people make that assumption, because of course the banks have to go through the same level of checking we have to go through. So if they've given them a bank account and they're holding the money, you'd think they've been through the checks. And believe you me, they probably have. The banks spend $5 billion a year on AML compliance between them. So it's a lot of money and resource being put into making sure the banks do their bit. But there's nothing in the legislation that excuses you if you're doing that activity. If you've got to comply with the CDD, nothing that says you can rely on the bank instead. You've got to do your own checks. Why? Because they want as many people's eyes on it as possible. They don't want you skipping the step because it's in a UK bank. The fact of the matter is, and I've got many examples of this, where the bank have been suspicious, have done a report to the police, and the police have given them consent to continue to move the money, making it available for the law firm. They can't tell the law firm of that because of a pesky thing called tipping off, which I'm sure you've heard about before. They can't tell you that. So that's why you can't assume that it's clean, because they could have been suspicious about it. They're just not allowed to tell you. Now, one of the most important things I can do for you today, especially if you're a conveyancer, is explain the importance of your record keeping in this space. Obviously, we know, I've just told you about Neil Bolton and Billy didn't have the records to back up that he'd thought about it. When we audit, we say, if we sit down tomorrow and pick up your files for auditing, can we see that you've understood the purpose and nature of the business relationship, and that you've conducted ongoing monitoring in relation to this case? And if you ask yourself that question, as I ask many lawyers, the answer quite often is no, you can't, because it's often in your head. Yeah, you might have some bank statements, but can I see that you've figured out what they mean and what they're saying? Again, if you can learn nothing else from me today, once you've gathered in that information, whether it's actual bank statements or you've accessed open banking, so you go straight to the source for that information, which, you know, how technology can benefit us. We don't have to worry about it being forged if we can use open banking to go straight to the source. If you're doing that, the most important thing you can do is say, I have looked at X, Y, and Z, and I'm satisfied that I'm happy to proceed, that I have no concerns of money laundering. That's the piece of paper you want to wave at someone if somebody comes along and says, by the way, the client you're acting for is Billy Black and he's part of an organised crime group. You want to say, haha, but I thought about it. I really did my best. That's the best that we can do to protect you guys. So yeah, keep a record. That's it for me, I think, on the slides.
Thank you, Amy. So we've had a few questions in the Q&A box come through, so we're just going to run through the questions now.
Yes.
One of the questions that we have was from earlier on in the webinar. Can you confirm the amount that you can accept in advance of AML checks? For example, can you accept £500 on accounts before you do the checks?
What a great question that is. There isn't a number that I can give you. I can tell you how you can decide on a number that will stack up or hopefully stack up. Here's the law. The law says you must carry out the client ID part of client due diligence prior to the establishment of a business relationship. The regulators would prefer that you do the client ID bit before you open a file. Now that's tricky because a lot of our processes are part of file opening. So the reason the regulators like it that way is that they know if a file's open, then you've done the checks that you need to do. So they would prefer it that way. However, in many conveyancing practices, especially if you're wanting to see and take a copy of an original document and then feed that through your CDD searches, which, you know, a lot of people did to comply with the UK Finance Handbook. If you're wanting to get anything from the client, that takes time, but conveyancing time's of the essence, right? Especially if you want to show to the seller that you're serious. And so practice has developed in many firms where they open the file, they get the number, and then they get the file number, ask the client for the search fees, and then they crack on with the CDD. It is possible, regulation 30(3) of the regulation says you can delay the ID and V until after you've established a business relationship, provided that there is little risk of money laundering, you do it as soon as practicable. And you're doing it because it interrupted the ordinary conduct of business. And the LSAG guidance has clarified that whilst you're doing that, if you're in that period of I've started but I'm waiting for the ID documents, you can receive money on account of fees, not money for the transaction, but money on account of fees. And my risk management advice to that would be you better make sure you're spending it as well. Because if you have to send it back and you've got any suspicions about that person, then that's money laundering. If you're suspicious about that money might be dirty if you're sending it back. If you spent it though, and they're not having it back, then it's gone, hasn't it? You've spent it on the searches. So there's no number, there's no de minimis in the legislation either. There's no lower limit below which we won't trigger the AML legislation if we're doing a transaction. We won't trigger the money laundering regulations if we're doing a transaction. So what is typical for me to see is for firms to say something like, you can, in the policy, you can open the file and you can have up to an amount of money in respect of money on account and fees, disbursements. That ranges in practice from £200 to £1,000. There's, you know, it's what's appropriate for that firm and what they might be taking money for. Remember, of course, your policy for your department doesn't necessarily work for the whole firm. So it might not just be anchored in how much the searches are going to be. It depends what your firm does. So yeah, so there is no right number. There's no de minimis below which you don't have to worry about it. It is possible for you to collect money in before you've done the ID. If you're going to allow that though, please, a piece of advice from me, make sure you've got some way of checking it gets done, because your gate of you can't have a file number then is gone. That control is gone. So you need a new control. Usually you're going to want to say, but you have to do it within X number of days and then try and run a report that says how many cases past this days haven't got it. And some firms will say, right, well, now you're not allowed to do any more work, or you're not allowed to do any time recording or whatever it is. I know time recording is not as prevalent in conveyancing as it is in other parts of the practice. So yeah, you want a gate, you want a control to make sure it does get done if you are going to let people start work before they've done the ID and V.
Okay, thank you so much for answering that question, Amy. I'm just going to hand over to Lauren French from our electronic client onboarding solution team, and she's just going to run through the product and let us know a little bit more about how you can sort of verify those things.
Cool, thank you. I'm just going to try and share my screen, and we always know it always goes well on Zoom. Just give me a second. Brilliant. So this is the eCOS InfoTrack AML check. What's slightly different with the eCOS version of the AML is that we incorporate both the verification of ID and the AML check into one report for you. So currently we offer a verification of ID search, which will basically scan a picture of your client's ID document, scan a picture of their face, and we'll do biometric matching to match that individual to that person in the ID photo. And at that point, if they've done it through the NFC scanning the chip through our app, they can get Safe Harbour compliance there because we do the additional address verifications as well. So with our new AML, which we are currently in the process of going live with, we've enhanced that product to include the full AML checks for all the data sets needed to be compliant, including your PEPs and your sanctions, everything like that. And you get your 12 months ongoing monitoring there as well. So if any changes happen to that result up until midnight, 12 months later, we will let you know and issue a new report to you saying, hey, this changed. You might want to go have a double look. So what I'm going to do is just go very quickly through this report, explain the different sections. Any questions, please pop them in the Q&A box, and also happy to have an extra session separately if you do have any more thing to talk about eCOS. So front page, you got your summary of your VOI and your AML, and also the image from the selfie we asked the client to take, and a blown up image of the ID document as well. So you can see both of those. Go into your ID document verification, you'll get a picture of the ID document that was used and all the information that we've managed to automatically extract from that data. So in this case, name, date of birth, gender, address, and then if you've done it through your passport, you'll have your MRZ check, okay or fail on there if we're unable to extract any data. In this instance, you can see the result was a pass. If it's been flagged as being a photocopy or a tampered document or a fake document, we'll flag that at that point and say, no, not a legitimate document, double check that, and that would be a fail. You then get your selfie and your face to ID image verification, and we do that by placing about 75 to 80 points along the face, along the cheekbones, along the thing, and try and match those, and we get a pass rate there. And if it does not match, you've accidentally used your partner's ID, which weirdly we see a lot, it would fail at that point. And then your address verification. So we will always take the address of the ID document where it's available, and we'll always ask you for the date you moved in. So, and if that date was less than 2 years ago, we will ask the client to provide an additional address. So we'll always be searching against 2 years of address history, and we'll be trying to match the full name, the date of birth, and the address against at least 2 independent sources on our electoral roll and the credit-based register. If you've gone to go through Safe Harbour, so you've scanned your chip, this is the results there using the results of your ID check, your valid ID, the scan, and then the address documents. You pass all of those, we'll give you compliant for Safe Harbour. If you have not done any of those steps, or you've done 3 out of 4, unfortunately, we can't give you the Safe Harbour, and we'll tell you why. So in this case, this particular journey, I did it on the desktop, not from my phone, so I wasn't able to scan that chip. Into the AML risk assessment result. So you've got your reason, in this case it's compliant, the data we searched against, so we've got the name, date of birth, everything there that was searched, along with any addresses that we checked against, and also we would reveal any PEPs and sanctions at this point as well. Obviously, this is the perfect result. Everything's green, you've got green ticks, you guys still need to check your stuff, but it makes it much easier. Doesn't always figure out that way though. and you do end up sometimes with a review or a non-compliant result. So I'm just going to skim through that really quickly. All of this stuff's kind of the same. To show you if you've got a risk assessment result, and whether your address check has failed or a PEP or a sanction or something similar has been revealed, we will tell you what that is. And on our reports, if there is a PEP or a sanction revealed, where an image is available of that PEP or sanction, we will show that to you. Not every person's ever had their photo taken, and it tends to be your tier 1 PEPs will always have a photo because they tend to be in the media more, but we'll give that as much information there as we can so you guys can make a call. Is this the person that I am working with? If you find out that actually, no, it's not, it's been a mismatch on the PEP, that's not my individual, and you want to update the result to be a compliant result, you can do that. And we've got an update service through InfoTrack where you can say, I am comfortable saying this person is compliant. You're made to give a reason, and you'll have to upload some additional evidence to say, this is how I come to this decision. And at that point, you would end up with an updated risk assessment result here. We will never delete the original result we gave you. It will say original risk assessment result. You'll just get an updated one at that point saying it's now compliant. It was updated by this person at this time on this date from this firm, and this is why I've updated this result. And then if in 3 months' time a new sanction is revealed for that individual, what will happen is InfoTrack will update your result to non-compliant, reissue that to you, and we'll say, we found a new sanction match for this individual, go and do some more investigation. So this is pretty much our AML offering at the minute. I'm going to stop the share and allow questions to pop in for marketing. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. So as we are running low on time, I'm just going to ask about 2 more questions before we take the rest of them offline. So for those who have submitted questions as an anonymous attendee, please do send an email follow-up to Liz. So eliz.alkaner, ALKANER @infotrack.co.uk, and we'll be able to follow up on those questions. So the next question that we will be taking today is, am I right in thinking lenders won't accept electronic verification of ID? So that's either to yourself, Amy. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, so, well, of course, it depends on each individual lender, but if they're focusing on the UK Finance Handbook, I think you have to be really careful with the wording in the UK Finance Handbook. The historical position was, and this only applies if you're in England, Wales, Northern Ireland, or the Isle of Man. If you're in Scotland, different words in the handbook for you. I don't know why, there just is. I have asked, why Scotland got different rules. Nobody can tell me. It's been that long since it happened. Nobody remembers why it is. But if you have a look at it, I want to say it's 3.1.6, something like that. And in there, it envisages the old way of us doing client due diligence, where in order to be confident, before biometrics, before facial recognition and all of these things, what they envisaged was that you would see and take a copy of a document which has a signature on. Now, why do they want you to do that? Because they want you to compare that signature against the mortgage deed to guard against mortgage fraud. Remember, I said that was one of the things that you're using your ID process for. And so the original drafting talks about seeing and taking a copy of a document. Now, here's the thing. When you engage with any of these new processes, you're going to get a copy of the document, whether the client supplied it or the provider provided it because they captured it throughout the process, or you took a photocopy of it and you uploaded the data off it. Lots of different ways of doing it across the sector, across the different providers. But you're going to get a copy somewhere along the line, usually. The sticking point is the seeing and taking a copy of. And does a copy obtained through the process of the biometrics and the client-driven processes, does that copy comply with what's required by the UK Finance Handbook or not? So the sticking point is seeing and taking a copy. It's the taking a copy. I think traditionally that was that was seen to be handling the document, sticking it on a photocopier. But of course, that's not what you did when you did certified copies. Someone else took it and stuck it on a photocopier, not you, and you accepted that for loads of years. So I can't tell you the right answer because number one, it depends on actually the instructions you get in. Number two, it depends on your interpretation of that part of the UK Finance Handbook. What I do know is this, seeing and taking a copy, and so using the kind of long established paper-based way of doing it without this additional verification that's available now, baddies can get fake passports. If they know which pub to go in, it's cost them £50 to get a fake passport to give to you that you're going to see a signature on and you're going to see and take a copy of. There's potentially more risk of you being duped by someone with an original document than there is these processes. So query, are you likely to be safer from fraud by using the electronic services than actually defaulting to the getting the paper copy and avoiding the electronic services? All of that said, at the Law Society's property conference late last year, UK Finance did concede that they needed to look at the handbook to take into account the developments in technology. So last time I asked them, I will say I haven't asked them for over like 18 months. The last time a client asked me to ask them about electronic ID. The last time I asked them, they said, oh no, you've got to go to each individual lender. That said, I do know that there are conveyancers out there, especially some of the bigger ones, that are just using electronic verification and are either gone to the lenders and say, we're going to do this if you've got a problem, or are assuming that it's a commercial risk that they're prepared to take, that it turns out to be a fraud. So yeah, can't give you a right answer to that. I can just tell you the things you've got to think about.
Okay, mate, I think we'll just do one more question and then we'll have to call it a day. So the next one is, any advice on any further checks on overseas accounts at all? We have a lot of Hong Kong clients and they are always more than happy to provide proof of funds, but they're difficult to read and we can't prove their source of funds when it's in savings.
There is a real debate about what the right thing to do here is. You know, I think you have to be risk-based. The whole thing with AML checks is that they're risk-based. Got to consider the risk. You can't do nothing. Got to make sure that what you do is appropriate for the risk. We know that property transaction is considered high risk for money laundering. We also know in the case of money coming from Hong Kong that it is a typology people use to subvert the foreign exchange control out of China, so they route the money through there. And that can be where the complexity comes, because you can't actually get the source of wealth information from China, because to do that they'd have to explain that they were subverting the rules by doing it this way, so they're reluctant to give you that information. As to you know, Hong Kong has its own special issues that people think about because of that, but whether you should get a translator to do it or not, I think technology these days is great, and you can get services that can help you understand what is there. Although you know, copy typing it into Google Earth, you're not going to be able to do. If they've sent you a PDF of the document, that might be not Google Earth, Google Translate. It's not going to be that helpful if you've got a PDF of a document you're trying to do. You know, I have seen people try to tackle this by getting family members to translate, but you've obviously got to be aware of what if they're lying risk of that. You've also got to balance it against the I'm saying I'm not acting for you because I can't understand what you're telling me. You know, and the obligation in the code of conduct for solicitors and for firms to not discriminate against clients. So I think it's really tricky. And what I do find a lot of people do, if they've got work that is coming from that area, they will engage either a staff member who can understand what translate in situ in the office, they're retained by the firm, or they do look for a regular service from a translator. There are actually more than you'd think people who are out there who can provide this service, so it might not be kind of eye-wateringly expensive to access that. But if there is something in those source of funds, source of wealth documents, this goes for like loads of things when it comes to source of funds, source of wealth. If there's something in there that indicates a problem and you couldn't understand it, like Mr. Patel, remember, on our overpayment that he missed, I think that is something that the regulators would take action for if it came across their desk.
Perfect. Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Lauren, for joining the webinar today. Just as I said earlier, if you submitted a question and you haven't, we haven't had the chance to answer it, please do submit your question to the email I'll be providing in the chat box. Just to wrap things up, this webinar is being recorded, so we will send you that recording. And thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.